Hello and good afternoon, everyone. This is Pastor Stucki, or Pastor Sean, and welcome to the show for this week. What we're going to be going over is hyper-reality for this week's episode as our exploration video. I know that I was actually going to be putting out an episode of prayer, where I was going to put out about a 6 to 7 hour prayer, but due to feeling ill, I believe I caught the cold again, or I'm having sinus problems, or I'm having sinus pressure. I'm just not able to talk for a long time without getting weak. So what I'm going to be doing is having this robot read what hyperreality is, instead of me doing the reading, which is what I would normally do for the Wikipedia post. And then we will go on to other websites to also find information on hyperreality for the psychology segment here on the Death Church Radio podcast. So let's go ahead and get started.
Hyperreality, in semiotics and postmodernism, is an inability of consciousness to distinguish reality from a simulation of reality, especially in technologically advanced postmodern societies. Hyperreality is seen as a condition in which what is real and what is fiction are seamlessly blended together so that there is no clear distinction between where one ends and the other begins. One, it allows the commingling of physical reality with virtual reality, VR, and human intelligence with artificial intelligence, AI. One, individuals may find themselves, for different reasons, more in tune or involved with the hyperreal world and less with the physical real world. Some famous theorists of hyperreality/hyperrealism include Jean Baudrillard, Albert Borgman, Daniel J. Boorstin, Neil Postman, and Umberto Eco. Origins and usage. The postmodern semiotic concept of hyperreality was contentiously coined by French sociologist Jean Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation. Baudrillard defined hyperreality as the generation by models of a real without origin or reality. 2. Hyperreality is a representation, a sign, without an original referent. Baudrillard believes hyperreality goes further than confusing or blending the real with the symbol which represents it. It involves creating a symbol or set of signifiers which represent something that does not actually exist, like Santa Claus. Baudrillard in particular suggests that the world we live in has been replaced by a copy world, where we seek simulated stimuli and nothing more. Baudrillard borrows, from Jorge Luis Borges on exactitude in science, already borrowed from Lewis Carroll, the example of a society whose cartographers create a map so detailed that it covers the very things it was designed to represent. When the empire declines, the map fades into the landscape. He says that, in such a case, neither the representation nor the real remains, just the hyperreal. Baudrillard's idea of hyperreality was heavily influenced by phenomenology, semiotics, and Marshall McLuhan. Baudrillard challenges McLuhan's famous statement that the medium is the message, by suggesting that information devours its own content. Hyperreality is the inability of consciousness to distinguish reality from a simulation of reality, especially in technologically advanced societies. 3. However, Baudrillard's hyperreality theory goes a step further than McLuhan's medium theory. There is not only an implosion of the message in the medium, there is, in the same movement, the implosion of the medium itself in the real, the implosion of the medium and of the real in a sort of hyperreal nebula, in which even the definition and distinct action of the medium can no longer be determined. 4. Italian author Umberto Eco explores the notion of hyperreality further by suggesting that the action of hyperreality is to desire reality and in the attempt to achieve that desire, to fabricate a false reality that is to be consumed as real. 5. Linked to contemporary Western culture, Umberto Eco and post-structuralists would argue that in current cultures fundamental ideals are built on desire and particular sign systems. Hyperreality can also be thought of as reality by proxy. Simply put, an individual takes on someone else's version of reality and claims it as their own. For example, persons who watch soap operas for an extended period of time may develop a view of interpersonal relationships, reality, that are skewed by how the writers depict the characters and situations within the show. Individuals may begin to believe that these extreme dramatic relationships are authentic and real, and they may begin to judge social relationships and situations by this heightened lens of reality. 6. Significance. Hyperreality is significant as a paradigm to explain current cultural conditions. Consumerism, because of its reliance on sign exchange value, e.g. brand X shows that one is fashionable, car Y indicates one's wealth, could be seen as a contributing factor in the creation of hyperreality or the hyperreal condition. Hyperreality tricks consciousness into detaching from any real emotional engagement, instead opting for artificial simulation, and endless reproductions of fundamentally empty appearance. Essentially, although Baudrillard himself may balk at the use of this word, fulfillment or happiness is found through simulation and imitation of a transient simulacrum of reality, rather than any interaction with any real reality. While hyperreality is not a relatively new concept, its effects are more relevant today than when it was first conceptualized. Citation needed. This is attributed to the way it effectively captured the postmodern condition, particularly how people...
Okay, so I just want to say really quick here. So when it's talking about the significance here of you being able to... You're feeling the emotions of a character on a soap opera, for example, and also it has to do with, computer culture. So, like, say hyperreality is basically the video game Second Life or IMVU or The Sims, like anything where you are a different person that you modified through the video game. So that's what I'm understanding as to what hyperreality is. So let's go ahead and continue.
How people in the postmodern world seek stimulation by creating unreal worlds of spectacle and seduction and nothing more. 7. There are dangers to the use of hyperreality within our culture. Individuals may observe and accept hyperreal images as role models when the images don't necessarily represent real physical people. This can result in a desire to strive for an unobtainable ideal, or it may lead to a lack of unimpaired role models. Daniel J. Boorstin cautions against confusing celebrity worship with hero worship. We come dangerously close to depriving ourselves of all real models. We lose sight of the men and women who do not simply seem great because they are famous but who are famous because they are great. 8. He bemoans the loss of old heroes like Moses, Ulysses S. Grant, Aeneas, Jesus, Julius Caesar, Muhammad, Joan of Arc, William Shakespeare, George Washington, Napoleon, and Abraham Lincoln, who did not have public relations, PR, agencies to construct hyperreal images of themselves. 9. The dangers of hyperreality are also facilitated by information technologies, which provide tools to dominant powers that seek to encourage it to drive consumption and materialism. 10.
Okay, so just to stop right there. When it comes to Jesus and Jesus Christ, God, the Son of God, being in danger of not being relatable and would fall off the wayside because he doesn't fit into culture, that has to do with that Bible verse on the gates of hell. So the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, which is in Matthew chapter 16, verse 17 through 19. So I'll go ahead and throw that up on here really quick. So it starts at verse 17.
17. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. 18. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. The danger in the pursuit.
So, on this rock I will build my church, when Jesus is talking to Peter, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So it doesn't matter how irrelevant it comes to millennial culture or whatever it is that you would like to call it. Jesus will never become irrelevant. God is never changing. So let's continue here. Just wanted to throw that in there to give my 2 cents about that when it talked about people like Jesus and Moses.
The danger in the pursuit of stimulation and seduction emerge not in the lack of meaning but, as Baudrillard maintained, we are gorged with meaning and it is killing us. 11. Hyperreality, some sources point out, may provide insights into the postmodern moment by analyzing how simulations disrupt the binary opposition between reality and illusion, but it does not address or resolve the contradictions inherent in this tension. 12. Key relational themes. Simulation/simulacra. The concepts most fundamental to hyperreality are those of simulation and the simulacrum, first conceptualized by Jean Baudrillard in his book Simulacra and Simulation. The two terms are separate entities with relational origin connections to Baudrillard's theory of hyperreality. Simulation. Simulation is characterized by a blending of reality and representation, where there is no clear indication of where the former stops and the latter begins. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. 13. Baudrillard suggests that simulation no longer takes place in a physical realm, it takes place within a space not categorized by physical limits, i.e., within ourselves, technological simulations, etc.
Also, to stop here before I continue, I'm also assuming it has to possibly do with the movies like Blade Runner and Star Wars, because those, I guess, would be technically considered hyper-real films, I'm assuming. So, continuing.
Simulacrum. The simulacrum is often defined as a copy with no original, or as Gilles Deleuze, 1990, describes it, the simulacrum is an image without resemblance. 14. Baudrillard argues that a simulacrum is not a copy of the real, but becomes truth in its own right. He created 4 steps of reproduction. 1. Basic reflection of reality. 2. Perversion of reality. 3. Pretense of reality, where there is no model. And 4. Simulacrum, which bears no relation to any reality whatsoever. 15. Definitions. A real without origin or reality. Jean Baudrillard 16. The authentic fake. Umberto Eco 17 1819. Quotations. Henceforth, it is the map that precedes the territory precession of simulacra. It is the map that engenders the territory, and if we were to revive the fable today, it would be the territory whose shreds are slowly rotting across the map. Jean Baudrillard, The Precession of Simulacra, and Simulation. Examples. Disneyland. Both Umberto Eco and Jean Baudrillard refer to Disneyland as an example of hyperreality. Eco believes that Disneyland with its settings such as Main Street and full-sized houses has been created to look absolutely realistic, taking visitors' imagination to a fantastic past. 20. This false reality creates an illusion and makes it more desirable for people to buy this reality. Disneyland works in a system that enables visitors to feel that technology and the created atmosphere can give us more reality than nature can. 21. The fake nature of Disneyland satisfies our imagination and daydream fantasies in real life. The idea is that nothing in this world is real. Nothing is original, but all are endless copies of reality. Since we do not imagine the reality of simulations, both imagined and real are equally hyperreal. For example, the numerous simulated rides, including the submarine ride and the Mississippi boat tour. For when entering Disneyland, consumers form into lines to gain access to each attraction. Then they are ordered by people with special uniforms to follow the rules, such as where to stand or where to sit. If the consumers follow each rule correctly, they can enjoy the real thing and see things that are not available to them outside of Disneyland stores. 22. In his work Simulacra and Simulation, Baudrillard argues the imaginary world of Disneyland magnetizes people inside and has been presented as imaginary to make people believe that all its surroundings are real. But he believes that the Los Angeles area is not real, thus it is hyperreal. Disneyland is a set of apparatuses which tries to bring imagination and fiction to what is called real. This concerns the American values and way of life in a sense and concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle. 23. The Disneyland imaginary is neither true or false, it is a deterrence machine set up in order to rejuvenate in reverse the fiction of the real. Whence the debility, the infantile degeneration of this imaginary. It's meant to be an infantile world, in order to make us believe that the adults are elsewhere, in the real world, and to conceal the fact that real childishness is everywhere, particularly among those adults who go there to act the child in order to foster illusions of their real childishness. 24. Filmography. Existence. D.I.R. David Cronenberg. Jennifer Jason Leigh, Jude Law. Miramax, 1999. Film.
Okay, we're going to get to the other examples here for the Wikipedia article. Okay, so I understand. So I guess Disneyland would be technically an example of hyperreality. And I guess Six Flags and other theme parks that has themes revolving around movies and people dressing up as characters in costumes, I guess it does make sense. So, okay, I understand what this is talking about.
Other examples. Films in which characters and settings are either digitally enhanced or created entirely from CGI, e.g., 300, where the entire film was shot in front of a blue/green screen, with all settings superimposed. In A Clockwork Orange when Alex says, "It's funny how the colors of the real world only seem really real when you vidi them on the screen," when he undergoes Ludovico's technique. A well-manicured garden, nature as hyperreal. Any massively promoted versions of historical or present facts, e.g. general ignorance from Chi, where the questions have seemingly obvious answers, which are actually wrong. Professional sports athletes as super, invincible versions of human beings. Many world cities and places which did not evolve as functional places with some basis in reality, as if they were creatio ex nihilo, literally creation out of nothing. Black Rock City, Disney World, Dubai, Celebration, Florida, and Las Vegas. TV and film in general, especially reality TV, due to its creation of a world of fantasy and its dependence that the viewer will engage with these fantasy worlds. The current trend is to glamorize the mundane using histrionics.
I'm just going to stop right there. Not exactly sure if... I don't know about football, but pro wrestling actually sounds more hyper real than, like, let's say a football player like Ben Roethlisberger or Joe Montana or someone that you would think is invincible on the field. But the thing is that they're really getting. I don't know if pain has to do with that. Actually, I'm not sure. Pro wrestling makes sense because it's staged physical theater, so that one makes sense as it to being hyper real, but I'm not really sure about football or other sports. But anyways, let's continue here.
A retail store that looks completely stocked and perfect due to facing, creating an illusion of more merchandise than there actually is. A high-end sex doll used as a simulacrum of an unattainable partner. 25.
Oh my.
A newly made building or item designed to look old, or to recreate or reproduce an older artifact, by simulating the feel of age or aging. Such as reborn dolls. Constructed languages, such as E-Prime, or reconstructed extinct...
Oh, the reborn dolls. Okay, so this is basically cognitive dissonance. It was like that video that I watched at one time from Vsauce 1 about things that look real, but they're fake. So that, okay, I understand.
Constructed languages, such as E-Prime, or reconstructed extinct dialects. Second Life, the distinction becomes blurred when it becomes the platform for...
Yeah, Second Life, this is what I was talking about earlier in the video.
Second Life, the distinction becomes blurred when it becomes the platform for RL, real life, courses and conferences, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, or leads to real-world interactions behind the scenes. Weak virtual reality. 26. The 2008 film Synecdoche, New York, in which the life of the main character Caden Cotard is lived in the confines of a warehouse made to be the set of a play which is about his life, blurring all distinction between what is real and the simulation. The super-fictional airline company Ingold Airlines. Works within the spectrum of the vaporwave musical genre, often encompass themes of hyperreality through parody of the information revolution. 27. Plastic surgery, the constructed face that effaces the distinction between natural and artificial in the syntax of beauty. Airbrushed images of men and women. For example, Dove's campaign for real beauty.
Yeah, I guess the themes in music, because that is actually my favorite music genre, is vaporwave. I guess that does make sense, and also with women and men getting plastic surgery. So, okay, I can definitely see that. Okay. Let's go ahead and get to the next parts of this for the hyperreality video. Okay, I did find this article that was written back in 2003 by Nicholas Oberle in an explanation as to what hyperreality slash reality is. So let's go ahead and take a look at this.
Reality, hyperreality, 1. The Oxford English Dictionary defines reality foremost as the quality of being real or...
Oh, sorry. I was having some technical difficulties there.
Reality, hyperreality, 1. The Oxford English Dictionary defines reality foremost as the quality of being real or having an actual existence and supplements this with a definition of real as having objective existence, and finally to exist as having place in the domain of reality. These conventional definitions of reality represent a larger problem in the attempt to locate the real on the most basic level, for they are wholly circular, a set of signifiers reflecting back at each other lacking the grounding necessary to render meaning. This problem is not unique to the word reality, indeed almost all words and signs are only able to refer back towards the internal exchange of other signs in order to produce a theoretical anchor. The slippage of reality, its elusiveness encountered even in a basic search for a definition, is an element of the hyperreal, a condition in which the distinction between the real and the imaginary implodes. There is no static definition of hyperreality, and the interpretations employed by theorists vary on some of the most essential terms. That said, this article will attempt to extrapolate a common understanding of the hyperreal based on the work of several theorists. A general understanding of hyperreality is important, for it is an issue at the crux of several critical debates within the study of media, including semiotics, objects, and space, the spectacle, performativity, the examination of mass media, Platonism, resistance, and the structure of reality. The concept most fundamental to hyperreality is the simulation and the simulacrum. See simulation/simulacra, 2. The simulation is characterized by a blending of reality and representation, where there is no clear indication of where the former stops and the latter begins. The simulacrum is often defined as a copy with no original, or as Gilles Deleuze, 1990.
Cognitive dissonance again. Okay, sorry about that. Let's continue. It's the
simulacrum is often defined as a copy with no original, or...
Sorry, I'll start that over again. It's actually the video that I just remembered as Why Are Things Creepy by Vsauce1. His name's Michael, the scientist. So he talks about that in terror and fright and things that are scary, like creepy, like things like that. Some of that has to do with hyperreality. Continuing here.
The simulacrum is often defined as a copy with no original, or as Gilles Deleuze, 1990, describes it. The simulacrum is an image without resemblance, p. 257. Jean Baudrillard, 1994, maps the transformation from representation to simulacrum in 4 successive phases of the image, in which the last is that it has no relation to any reality whatsoever, it is its own pure simulacrum, SSP.6. See mimesis, representation. Deleuze, Baudrillard, and several other theorists trace the proliferation and succession of simulacra to the rise of hyperreality and the advent of a world that is either partially, or entirely simulated. Frederick Jameson, 1990, contends that one of the conditions of late capitalism is the mass reproduction of simulacra, creating a world with an unreality and a free-floating absence of the reverent, p. 17. Although theorists highlight different historical developments to explain hyperreality, common themes include the explosion of new media technologies, the loss of the materiality of objects, the increase in information production, the rise of capitalism and consumerism, and the reliance upon God and/or the center in Western thought. Essentially, certain historical contingencies allow for the wide-scale reproduction of simulacra so that the simulations of reality replace the real, producing a giant simulacrum completely disconnected from an earlier reality. This simulacrum is hyperreality. One of the fundamental qualities of hyperreality is the implosion of
just to make sure what this is of a simulacrum, which is a fake simulation, I'm assuming. I'm just going to look this up really quick. A simulacrum. An image or representation of someone or something. Okay, so a fake person or a fake object is what I'm understanding here. Okay. All right, let's continue.
One of the fundamental qualities of hyperreality is the implosion of Ferdinand Saussure's 1959 model for the sign. See semiotics, pg 67. The mass simulacrum of signs become meaningless, functioning as groundless, hollow indicators that self-replicate in endless reproduction. Saussure outlines the nature of the sign as the signified, a concept of the real, and the signifier, a sound image. Baudrillard, 1981, claims the Saussurean model is made arbitrary by the advent of hyperreality, wherein the two poles of the signified and signifier implode in upon each other, destroying meaning, causing all signs to be unhinged and point back to a non-existing reality. 180. Another basic characteristic of the hyperreal is the dislocation of object materiality and concrete spatial relations. See objecthood. Some of these problems are explored in Paul Berillio's The Lost Dimension, in which he argues that modern media technology have created a crisis of representation where the distinctions between near and far, object and image, have imploded. p. 112. Virilio locates the vacuum of speed as the historical development which produces technology that overturn our original understanding of spatial relations by altering our perceptions. This machinery gives way to the televised instantaneity of a perspective observation, of a glance that pierces through the appearances of the greatest distances and the widest expanses. p. 31. These ethereal qualities of hyperreality mean drastic revision for media theory surrounding the spectacle. This theory was famously articulated by Guy Debord, 1977, who argued through neo-Marxian criticism that the spectacle has become central to capitalist modes of reproduction. p. 24. Hans Enzensberger also attempted his own socialist theory of the media and proposed theories of domination and potential resistance based on a liberal/Marxist critique, 1996. Yet, the world of hyperreality overturns any hope of a Marxist understanding of mass media, for the entire web of human meaning-making activities has been transformed into the...
Wait, Marxist, neo-Marxism? Why, what does Karl Marx have to do with this? I mean, because I know this has to do with the postmodernist movement, from what I'm understanding here. All right, we're just going to have to keep reading.
Activities has been transformed into the symbolic exchange of empty signs. The modes of production have been liquefied and leukemized into the giant political economy of exchanging signs. Stephen Best and Douglas Kellner present the hyperrealist argument against Debord and his colleagues. This is not to say that representation has simply become more indirect or oblique, as Debord would have it, but that in a world where the subject/object distance is erased, and where signs no longer refer beyond themselves to an existing, knowable world, representation has been surpassed, an independent object world is assimilated to and defined by artificial codes and simulation models, DBT-PG Web. The system of monetary exchange is an example of the hyperreal that should help to prevent any definitional confusion. Traditional explanations of the history of money will return to earlier societies in which people traded goods and tools that presumably had similar amounts of labor invested within their production/acquisition. At some point, a common good was substituted as a ground for exchange, and then later pecuniary units were produced in order to simulate the common exchange. At first the monetary units had inherent value in that they were made of precious metals, but they were eventually replaced with worthless paper units, and many contemporary economies are now substituting these papers for credit information stored in computer databanks. During the process of countless successive copies, the essential reality of exchange has long since been lost, with commodities now completely disconnected from their use value, their production cost, and even their function. Moreover, the foundational lie of exchange has long since been forgotten over the weight of countless simulacra, that there was never any trade grounded in reality, that symbolic exchange is precisely and only that which can only refer to other signs for meaning and definition.
I don't necessarily agree with that, nor agree that that would be a definition of hyperrealism. What does leftist politics have to do with this? And I don't understand that. Okay, onward.
The next important intersection between the theory of hyperreality and media studies is performativity. Although the problem of performance is not one unique to modernity, it does seem as though it has been exacerbated in the hyperrealist environment with the proliferation of identities and recognizable performative actions. Social performance is a copy that instantaneously reproduces itself by being viewed, thus disseminated to others who will potentially incorporate the performative action into their own technologies of self. Jeffrey T. Nealon in his book Alienating Politics interprets the work of Butler and Derrida to argue that basic performances underlie all social agency. Agency is necessarily a matter of response to already given codes. p. 23. But where are the originals, the carved wooden blocks that produce so many performative copies? The originals are constantly referenced through discursive performance, mostly as human nature or some equivalent concept. Performances based on gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, and a number of smaller modes of action consistently refer back to a fabricated biological essence, a truth of the body. Yet as my own performance in this course revealed, gender, and by insinuation the entire structure of human nature, is entirely performative, lacking any grounding in biological or otherwise human essence. My ability to simply change the gender of my everyday performance elucidated the lack of any biological grounding to gender or sex, and illuminated all social performance as media simulacrum.
No, that is also it's talking about hyperreality as like a video art form. That's not no, this has to do with the video that I did, I believe it was over 6 months ago, the gender roles study that I was doing, the 1 hour video that I did. This is what this guy is writing about here, where that's what I'm understanding here is changing your sex, changing your gender, changing this, changing that, when I believe the hyperrealism is only in really art and video format, like when I saw that movie Captain Marvel with my friends last night. That would be hyperrealism, but not that it really truly is reality. I'm not too sure about that. Anyways, onward.
Deleuze helps to connect hyperreality to another strain of media theory.
Oh, that was actually the wrong line. It's on paragraph before that, right here. Okay.
The role of performance within mass media must thus be studied in the two following ways. Firstly, as being reproduced among wide-scale audiences, and secondly, as a forged unreality that implies the realness of everyday performance. The first form of analysis is obvious. that commonly portrayed performances such as race or gender normalize those modes of behavior and train audiences to take on, improve, and master those performative identities, thus replicating the simulacra. Umberto Eco, 1983, touches on this aspect of simulations in his book Travels in Hyperreality, where he notes that the simulacrum not only produces illusion, but stimulates demand for it, p. 44. In the second instance of media criticism, Baudrillard's metaphor of Disneyland should be employed, that the constructed realm of fantasy exists to imply that the rest of the world is real, 1994, p. 12. The obviously unreal performances of characters in television and movies should be examined in light of their significant role for persuading populations that their own social performances are real, and providing the most foundational other to stabilize all identities. Deleuze helps to connect hyperreality to another strain of media theory originating in one of the oldest known media theorists, Plato. Suspicion of media technologies is not a uniquely modern phenomenon. Indeed, Plato advanced a critique of the written word through the dialogue of Socrates in the Phaedrus, quite similar to that of Baudrillard in CPS. Plato, in his allegory of the cave, purports the existence of truth in ideal forms, accessible not in reality but through the philosopher's ideas and intellectual pursuit of the forms. Plato presents a clear understanding of simulations in the caves. Although he concedes that any artistic reproduction of ideal forms would constitute representation, he is clear that it entails the copy of an original, true form. Deleuze argues that Plato contrasts these legitimate copies to fear.
Okay, I was about to say that I do not believe also that that is incorrect, but when thinking about it, about the allegory of the cave, that's going to have to be just breaking that down is going to have to be its own video. But I can see with the shadows on the wall and that it's perceived by certain people only looking at those shadows, that I guess that could be conceived. This guy's reaching for straws here, but I guess that could be received as hyperreality. Okay, continuing with
copies to fearful simulacra. Plato divides into the domain of images idols. On one hand there are copies icons, on the other there are simulacra phantasms, p. 256. It is thus that Deleuze is able to claim that with the arrival of hyperreality Platonism has been reversed, for any original truth or ideal forms that provided the anchor for representation have since been permanently lost in the reproduction of simulacra and the construction of a hyperreality without any connection to the real. The role of resistance in relation to hyperreality differs greatly among theorists. Some thinkers are fairly optimistic, such as Marshall McLuhan's portrayal of media technologies as a generally benign force, expanding and evolving toward a society with great communicative potential. This interpretation directly clashes with Baudrillard, who sees the mass media as inherently non-communicative, a quality that allows them to exert social control over mass populations. In his earlier work, Baudrillard's proposal for resistance is radical but clear: obliterate the transmitters, destroy the world of media technologies through revolutionary action and resume normal face-to-face conversation, 1981, p. 170. Yet in his later work, Baudrillard borders more on nihilism, with the closest articulation of resistance being his advocacy of mass indifference to simulacra, IL 1994, 60-61. Eco is far more hopeful about the possibilities for resistance. Eco, in a move theoretically similar to Enzensberger, advocates what he calls the guerrilla solution, modeled off the metaphor of guerrilla resistance. He claims that revolutionaries and critical theorists can use the grassroots television programming to spread their subversive message, 142-143. My own performance proposed a strategy of resistance adopted from the work of Judith Butler, to reverse certain performative signs in a subversive manner around the body so as to expose...
That's that woman. Okay, Judith Butler, that was the woman that I was reading about for that video. Okay, continuing.
Judith Butler, to reverse certain performative signs in a subversive manner around the body so as to expose, reveal, and to familiarize specific media technologies to dress in drag in order to denaturalize simulated norms of sex and gender.
Yeah, that's not...
Reveal, and to familiarize specific media technology.
That's... I can see how that's hyper reality. I guess. I can see that. Alright, continuing.
The conceptual use of hyperreality is consistent enough within the literature to give space for a common working definition for media theory, but the contrasting term reality is used in far too many divergent ways to arrive at a unified understanding. However, it may be helpful for readers to conclude this article with a few brief theories of reality as a starting point for further study. For Lacan, the term real is composed in opposition to that which is encompassed by the symbolic and the imaginary. See symbolic, real, imaginary. The real is what eludes representation, what cannot be either symbolized, in terms of Saussure's notion of signifiers, or imagined and perceived within the images of the conscious and unconscious, Sheridan 1978, p. 280. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, 1983, understand desire to be based upon the lack of the object, yet nonetheless a productive force that renders into reality the fantasy of that object. Reality is thus nothing more than a group fantasy reified by desiring machines, for desire produces reality, or stated another way, desiring production is one and the same thing as social production, p. 30. For a definition of reality in contrast to hyperreality, Baudrillard represents many of the hyperrealists with his claim that the real is fictional, a fantasy generated by doubling the signs of an unlocatable reality, 1994, p. 81. Baudrillard concludes on reality that it is nothing more than a fairy tale. It is now impossible to isolate the process of the real, or to prove the real, 1994, p. 21. Nicholas Oberle. Winter 2003.
Okay. I was thinking, as I was listening to this, what does leftist neo-Marxism have to do with hyperreality? But okay, so Judith, what was her name? Judith Butler. Yeah, she wrote those two books about that a sex of a person is like when a person goes on stage and when the person's under the spotlight, you can change your costume as if you're changing characters, and you can do that with your gender and sex, which is completely demonic. So, okay, we're going to look up some more information on this subject. Okay, and for this website I'm on that I just found called Ceasefire, is an A to Z of Theory by Jean Baudrillard. I'm not pronouncing that correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and play. It's a really long article, but I'm going to go ahead and continue. So about 8 pages here, which is pretty much going to describe everything that we need to know about this.
An A to Z of Theory, Jean Baudrillard, Hyperreality and Implosion. All is not well in the world of the capitalist code. In the latest essay of his series on Jean Baudrillard, Andrew Robinson explores the French thinker's account of the crisis of contemporary capitalism through 3 related concepts: hyperreality, fascination, and implosion. Robinson shows how, in this theory, too much effectiveness can be counterproductive. Hyperreality.
Okay, so this is actually written by a man named Andrew Robinson. Okay, I thought it was written by Jean, but okay, let's go ahead and start.
Hyperreality. The model of the code does not represent a prior social reality. It creates a new social reality, which Baudrillard terms hyperreality. Hyperreality is a special kind of social reality in which a reality is created or simulated from models, or defined by reference to models, a reality generated from ideas. The term has implications of too much reality, everything being on the surface, without mystery, more real than reality, too perfect and schematic to be true, like special effects, and parareality, an extra layer laid over, or instead of, reality. It is experienced as more real than the real, because of its effect of breaking down the boundary between real and imaginary. It is a real without origin or reality, a reality to which we cannot connect. Hyperreality differs from other realities in that the division between reality and imaginary disappears. Reality becomes a cybernetic game. It is as if, at a certain point of time, we left reality behind, and never noticed until now. We can no longer tell the former reality from hyperreality, and we wouldn't know if reality returned. Baudrillard does not suggest when this loss of reality happened, but it can be deduced from his work fairly easily. The final loss of meaning happened at some point after the 1960s. Baudrillard sees figures such as JFK and Marilyn Monroe as still having symbolic force. One might tentatively situate the transition in 1973 or 1979, at the point where neoliberalism takes root. Hyperreality corresponds to the disappearance of intensity. It becomes something cool, stripped of intense affective energies and the power of the symbolic and of fantasy. For instance, the hot commitment to labor is replaced by the cool execution of tasks.
Okay, I'm a little confused here. Marilyn Monroe and JFK. It's like this person's not. It's like they're not. I'm not understanding how this has to do with hyper reality. Like this is like what I was saying before. Like with, it makes sense for someone getting plastic surgery or something that's in a cognitive dissonance where you're not sure if something is real or not, but it looks real, so it confuses your brain. Or it has to do something with living like a second life in the game, like The Sims, for example. I don't understand why leftist politics. What does that have to do with this?
The hot art and film of historical investment is replaced by the cool functional or mocky national pleasure of perfectly simulated fiction. Baudrillard is often misunderstood. He does not use the term cool in the sense of fashionable or enjoyable. He is referring to the loss of heat. Heat is here a metaphor for intensity, enjoyment, as opposed to pleasure, and emotional investment. To be cool is to be apathetic, disillusioned, uncommitted. In hyperreality, simulators seek to make all of reality coincide with their models of simulation. The result is that the real is no longer real. For instance, production is now primarily virtual, the unreal circulation of values. Cinema is getting closer to an absolute reality in all its naked obviousness. Functional arrangements seek to create the greatest correspondence possible between the object and its function. Baudrillard terms such changes as expressions of an attitude to signs which is naive and paranoid, Puritan, and terrorist. Its destruction of the gap between signs and their referents creates immense social effects. For instance, one's experience of time collapses without accumulation and a referent. Time is increasingly experienced as an eternal present without end, rather than as a linear sequence. Fashion and fascination. Hyperreality is for Baudrillard simply one of a number of related cases of excessive or simulated forms. Today's regime is based on the compulsory sharing of meaning and of the real. This occurs instead of the sharing of secrets in a band, or of simulacra in sovereignty. It is because the importance of simulation is denied that things seem overpresent and obscene. All spheres tend to converge on the model of fashion, the commutation of signs. Baudrillard sees fashion as the absorption of past signs the same way machines absorb past labor. Consumption of fashion actually draws on the endless revival of past cultural forms as empty signs. Fashion simulates the innocence of becoming and the cyclical process of exchange. There is fashion wherever forms are reproduced from models, and not through their own determinations. The light play of fashion replaces the heavy meanings of production. Although this is part of the system's internal change, it is also subversive of the system. The free play of fashion renders all signs relative, rendering power arbitrary. Baudrillard thinks the left has become moralistic in its attacks on fashion as insubstantial. Instead, we should deconstruct the form of fashion and of the code. Fashion is more beautiful than the beautiful, as the model is truer than the true. As a result, they are fascinating. They give rise to a particular ecstatic experience arising from their excess. This experience comes from the collapse of the categorical distinctions, and bears a remnant of return to symbolic exchange. The experience, which is almost vertigo, today tends to become our only passion. Or rather, it replaces passion, being counterposed to passionate investments in the scene. It is the experience that arises when a body spins until all sense is lost, and then shines forth in its pure and empty form. It almost disappears, but remains fascinating.
What does that have to do with hyperrealism? That's my question here.
Such fascinating images deter the true, the real, and so on by getting too close to them. In this way, they put an end to the social. Information in the age of the internet is ecstatic because there is too much of it. Fascination exists in a field of non-contradiction, of entities beyond binaries. It happens, for instance, when the true is invested with the power of the false, the beautiful with the ugly, or the real with the unreal. It consists of a kind of contemplation of what exists. It carries a symbolic energy, opening into the field of symbolic exchange. It escapes from the ultimatum of meaning. The visible fades into these kinds of ecstatic forms, becoming the obscene, what is more visible than the visible. War becomes ecstatic in the nuclear form. With no proportionality between means to annihilate and goals of war, waging war becomes pointless. The social becomes ecstatic in the masses, the political, or violence, becomes ecstatic in terrorism. Objects become obscene as like commodities in circulation. Money becomes obscene in gambling, and capital speculation. Things take up too much room. They have too much meaning to be meaningful, as if they mean everything and they're...
Okay, we're just going to skip a lot of this, because I'm failing to understand what this has to do with the subject. It just sounds like it's leftist propaganda speech. That's what I'm saying here. Anyway, so I just deleted those 3 pages, so we're going to start on page 4.
The responsible subject is in a similar situation of crisis. The system rests on responsibility. But in a system based on bureaucratic programming, irresponsible actors are required, figures like Eichmann who simply obey orders or perform functions. The system is left constantly trying to exhort people to be responsible subjects while producing them as simple conductors of social power. Subjects are put into drift, into something like a constant unconscious state. Without fixed relations, everything turns into flows of transference. The replacement of meaning with functions makes people expect everything to work all the time. A few seconds delay in a web page loading becomes an inexplicable source of immense frustration. Causes have disappeared, but effects have become immense, as when a local disaster causes a global shutdown. And with the responsible subject no longer there, because it is an effect of the old subject-object split, people try desperately to impute responsibility. The excessive reservoir of floating responsibility through finding scapegoats or guilty parties is just waiting to be invested in any particular incident. The Katrina or Christchurch disasters get projected onto looters, Chilean forest fires are targeted as terrorism, social insecurity is projected onto Muslims, immigrants, minorities. Social problems of increasing triviality.
This has nothing to do with the subject. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and skip this whole thing here. I apologize for that. Yeah, ceasefire, this is not a good... I would not say this is a good website for getting information on that particular subject. So, let's try it again here. Oh, concept film. Okay, no, not that. I mean, just like, what is... I want to know the definition and then more... Like, if that definition was like 3 to 4 pages long, that's what I'm looking for here. I'm just not exactly sure. Let's try hyperrealism visual art. We're going to try that. Because I know for a fact that hyperrealism, to me, is purely just an art form. There's nothing else. There's nothing else to it, other than if you, like, say, for example, because this has been a hot topic button lately in 2019, where that there was a possibility that scientists are now maneuvering, like at the Boston, like that Boston's college. I'm not sure if they're specifically doing it or not, but that they're going to be projecting basically who you are through your memories and whatnot through your brain onto a device. I don't know, maybe a 3D printed device to basically make you as an AI. And I can understand, like Ex Machina, like that movie, I can understand how that could be hyper reality in the sense where it's in reality. So I just don't understand how once again, I know I've said this like 3 times already, what does neo-Marxism have to do with that? What is other things? It just sounds like that ceasefire article just sounds like another website or company or journalists, quote unquote, or whatever, that secretly the underlining tone is that they hate the President Trump and that they're going to take a random subject and talk about him and the people in his cabinet and talk about how they hate Republicans. Like, just I don't want to hear it. So let's try hyperrealism as visual art.
Hyperrealism is a genre of painting and sculpture resembling a high-resolution photograph. Hyperrealism is considered an advancement of photorealism by the methods used to create the resulting paintings or sculptures. The term is primarily applied to an independent art movement and art style in the United States and Europe that has developed since the early 1970s.
That's what I was looking
One, Carol
for.
Futterman is the forerunner in the hyperrealism movement along with Dwayne Hansen and John D'Andrea. 2-3. History. Belgian art dealer Izzy Bracat coined the French word hyperrealism, meaning hyperrealism, as the title of a major exhibition and catalogue at his gallery in Brussels in 1973. The exhibition was dominated by such American photorealists as Ralph Goings, Chuck Close, Don Eddy, Robert Bechdel and Richard McLean, but it included such influential European artists as Domenico Nolli, Gerhard Richter, Konrad Klapheck, and Roland Delkel Fr. Since then, hyperrealism has been used by European artists and dealers to apply to painters influenced by the photorealists. Among contemporary European hyperrealist painters we find Gottfried Helmwin, Austrian, Willem van Veldhuizen and Tijl Sparnaby, Dutch, Roger Witt of Rangel, Belgian, as well as the French Pierre Beria, Jacques Baudin, Ronald Bowen, Francois Breich, Gerard Schlosser, Jacques Monnery, Bernard Ranselick, Gilles Elio and Gerard Fromanger. 4-5. Charles Bell, Circus Act, Silk Screen on Paper, Smithsonian American Art Museum, 1995. Early 21st century hyperrealism was founded on the aesthetic principles of photorealism. American painter Dennis Peterson, whose pioneering works are universally viewed as an offshoot of photorealism, first used 6 hyperrealism to apply to the new movement and its splinter group of artists. 678 Graham Thompson wrote one demonstration of the way photography became assimilated into the art world is the success of photorealist painting in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It is also called superrealism or hyperrealism, and painters like Richard Estes, Dennis Peterson, Audrey Flack, and Chuck Close often work from photographic stills to create paintings that appear to be photographs. 6. However, hyperrealism is contrasted
Okay,
with
so it's the art style basically of a photograph that's popping out at you like it has a 3D rendering. Okay, so I understand that.
However, hyperrealism is contrasted with the literal approach found in traditional photorealist paintings of the late 20th century. 9 hyperrealist painters and sculptors use photographic images as a reference source from which to create a more definitive and detailed rendering, one that often, unlike photorealism, is narrative and emotive in its depictions. Strict photorealist painters tended to imitate photographic images, omitting or abstracting certain finite detail to maintain a consistent overall pictorial design. 10-11 They often omitted human emotion, political value, and narrative elements. Since it evolved from pop art, the photorealistic style of painting was uniquely tight, precise, and sharply mechanical with an emphasis on mundane, everyday imagery. 12. Hyperrealism, although photographic in essence, often entails a softer, much more complex focus on the subject depicted, presenting it as a living, tangible object. These objects and scenes in hyperrealism paintings and sculptures are meticulously detailed to create the illusion of a reality not seen in the original photo. That is not to say they're surreal, as the illusion is a convincing depiction of simulated reality. Textures, surface.
Yeah, so basically it's like when you draw a 3D box on paper. Okay.
Textures, surfaces, lighting effects, and shadows appear clearer and more distinct than the reference photo or even the actual subject itself. 13. Hyperrealism has its roots in the philosophy of Jean Baudrillard, the simulation of something which never really existed. 14. As such, hyperrealists create a false reality, a convincing illusion based on a simulation of reality, the digital photograph. Hyperreal paintings and sculptures are an outgrowth of extremely high-resolution images produced by digital cameras and displayed on computers. As photorealism emulated analog photography, hyperrealism uses digital imagery and expands on it to create a new sense of reality. 615 Hyperrealistic paintings and sculptures confront the viewer with the illusion of manipulated high-resolution images, though more meticulous. 16. Style and methods. Man in a Boat, 2002, by Ron Muick, is a hyperrealistic 1/3 scale sculpture. The hyperrealist style focuses much more of its emphasis on details and the subjects. Hyperreal paintings and sculptures are not strict interpretations of photographs, nor are they literal illustrations of a particular scene or subject. Instead, they use additional, often subtle, pictorial elements to create the illusion of a reality which in fact either does not exist or cannot be seen by the human eye. 17 Furthermore, they may incorporate emotional, social, cultural, and political thematic elements as an extension of the painted visual illusion, a distinct departure from the older and considerably more literal school of photorealism.
Photorealism. Okay, so I understand why that person was talking about that on the website. Okay. It branches off into politics, but like left-leaning politics. Okay.
Hyperrealist painters and sculptors make allowances for some mechanical means of transferring images to the canvas or mold, including preliminary drawings or grisaille underpaintings and molds. Photographic slide projections or multimedia projectors are used to project images onto canvases, and rudimentary techniques such as gridding may also be used to ensure accuracy. 19 Sculptures utilize polyesters applied directly onto the human body or mold. Hyperrealism requires a high level of technical prowess and virtuosity to simulate a false reality. As such, hyperrealism incorporates and often capitalizes upon photographic limitations such as depth of field, perspective, and range of focus. Anomalies found in digital images, such as fractalization, are also exploited to emphasize their digital origins by some hyperrealist painters, such as Chuck Close, Dennis Peterson, Bert Monroy, and Robert Bechtel. 20.
Okay.
Themes. Laura del Te by Magda Torres Gurza, oil on canvas, 90x140 cm.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue with the themes, and then I will find another, one more website that would talk more about the art aspect of this as opposed to like a political aspect. Okay, and continuing for the last parts of this video, of continuing for being an offshoot of photorealism, then hyper-realistic in a writing sense here, and then hyper-reality that I found the definition on a different website. So let's go ahead and continue here.
Subject matter ranges from portraits, figurative art, still life, landscapes, cityscapes, and narrative scenes. The more recent hyperrealist style is much more literal than photorealism as to exact pictorial detail with an emphasis on social, cultural, or political themes. This also is in stark contrast to the newer concurrent photorealism with its continued avoidance of photographic anomalies. Hyperrealist painters at once simulate and improve upon precise photographic images to produce optically convincing visual illusions of reality, often in a social or cultural context. 21-22. Some hyperrealists have exposed totalitarian regimes and third-world military governments through their narrative depictions of the legacy of hatred and intolerance. 23. Dennis Peterson and Gottfried Helmwind depicted political and cultural deviations of societal decadence in their work. Peterson's work 6 focused on diasporas, genocides, and refugees. 24. Helmwind developed unconventionally narrative work that centered on past, present, and future deviations of the Holocaust. Provocative subjects include enigmatic imagery of genocides, their tragic aftermath, and the ideological consequences. 25-20.
You know what I would hope with these artists, Dennis Peterson and Gottfried Helmwind, that they're also would use the hyperrealism art to also talk about the Bolshevik Revolution and things of that sort that have to do with communism. So, but it's just an open form that can be pretty much applied to anything that's totalitarianism. So, anyways.
Thematically, these controversial hyperreal artists aggressively confronted the corrupted human condition through narrative paintings as a phenomenological medium. 2070s lifelike paintings are an historical commentary on the grotesque mistreatment of human beings. 28-29. Hyperreal paintings and sculptures further create a tangible solidity and physical presence through subtle lighting and shading effects. Shapes, forms, and areas closest to the forefront of the image visually appear beyond the frontal plane of the canvas, and in the case of sculptures, details have more clarity than in nature. 30 hyperrealistic images are typically 10 to 20 times the size of the original photographic reference source, yet retain an extremely high resolution in color, precision, and detail. Many of the paintings are achieved with an airbrush, using acrylics, oils, or a combination of both. Ron Mueck's lifelike sculptures are scaled much larger or smaller than life and finished in incredibly convincing detail through the meticulous use of polyester resins and multiple molds. Bert Monroy's digital images appear to be actual paintings taken from photographs, yet they are fully created on computers. Hyperrealistic.
Right.
A term used by lazy and/or shitty writers, usually creepypasta writers, when they want to describe a piece of artwork that looks good enough to almost pass as a photo, but they also don't feel like writing out a meaningful description of said artwork.
Oh. I do apologize there for the cuss word. I didn't see that. Anyway, so this would be the hyper-realistic, way of writing what are called creepypastas online. Let's go ahead and look at that.
Hyperrealistic. A term used by lazy writers, usually creepypasta writers, when they want to describe a piece of artwork that looks good enough to almost pass as a photo, but they also don't feel like writing out a meaningful description of said artwork. Using this phrase more often than not puts a story into crappypasta territory. The sky had darkened, the title emblem was rusted and ruined, the Sega 1991 was now instead Sega 666, and the water had turned red, like blood, except it looked hyper-realistic. By Canis Minor, June 9, 2016.
Yeah, okay. Well, even though that's like a completely different subject. So hyper-reality, you're going to look at this one from a dictionary website from thefreedictionary.com/hyperreality.
Hyperreality. Aprility. N. PL ties. 1. Sociology, an image or simulation, or an aggregate of images and simulations, that either distorts the reality it purports to depict or does not in fact depict anything with a real existence at all, but which nonetheless comes to constitute reality. 2. Philosophy, an image or simulation, or an aggregate of images and simulations, that either distorts the reality it purports to depict or does not in fact depict anything with a real existence at all, but which nonetheless comes to constitute reality.
Okay. And also I would like to go over the opposite of it, which would be anarcho-primitivism, primitivism. Can't pronounce that. Let's go ahead and just pull it up right here.
Primitivism.
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 Okay. Actually, that's going to be next week's video because there is a lot to break down for this video, or for anarcho-primitives. I can't pronounce it. Primitive anarchy. So there's a lot to break down. So that's going to be, well, not next week's video because I'm going to be doing the podcast, but this will be within this next month or so. So thank you guys for listening to the breakdown as to what hyperreality is as an art form and what it, what the actual definition is, with getting some information from a couple of different websites here. So thank you once again for watching, guys. This is Pastor Sean, and God bless.